Policy man.
Oh no, don't give me that title, please.
Comes with a really 30-page, there's a bunch of words on it, like it's more civil policy. All right, so next we're gonna move into Territorial Sea Plan Part 2. It will be similar to what we just did with Andy giving a presentation and then opportunity for Q&A. I have heard from audience members that it's impossible to hear back there, particularly the Q&A session, so we're gonna all try and speak up more clearly and articulate loudly, and if people need to move up, they're welcome to do so, get a little bit closer. So with that, Andy, we're gonna roll into Part 2.
Okay, thank you, Gina. And just for a little bit of microphone coaching, you have to be almost touching the mic for it to pick you up, right? So again, it's not very pleasant to be touching the microphone while you're talking, but that can help. Okay, here we go. Part 2, how we make resource use decisions. There are, in general, 3 parts to this part 2, and it lays out the foundation for how the state will consistently evaluate ocean resource proposals to determine whether or not they satisfy Oregon's ocean resource protection policies. And again, those policies were what we just covered in Part 1. So specifically, there are 3 big sections. There's a description of what the resource inventory information and effects process is. There is a section that covers joint review panels, which are the kind of project review panel team, and I'll talk a lot more about this. That's not, in today's lingo, some people sitting around in a dispensary coming up with characteristics. And then the last part of Part 2 is the mandatory process for consulting with local coastal governments, including coastal Indian tribes. So, moving into the resource inventory and effects evaluation. This part is divided into 4 parts. The first part describes what the inventory is and what evaluation is required. The second part provides kind of a description of standards for decision making. So it can't be made on kind of an ad hoc basis. There's criteria that are used. There's the description of inventory content. So this kind of more relates to the quality of information being used to make a decision. And then the final piece of it is the effects evaluation, which is after you've reviewed the information based upon the criteria, a summary of what the reasonably foreseeable effects are of any proposed activity. So, what's in an inventory? The content of an inventory? A lot. And I've tried to smush it all onto one page just so you can get a sense of the breadth and depth of the information that we ask for from proponents of any proposal. So there's a description of the proposed action. That includes the location of using maps, charts, or description. It includes the number and sizes of items to be placed in or structures to be used. It includes the methods and techniques to do that. What you may be doing as you transit to and from a location to get to that proposed action. The materials that you may be disposing of while you're there. The physical or chemical properties of those materials and how they interact with the environment. Any navigational aids that might be required, and or a proposed time schedule. Right? So that's a pretty specific and very detailed definition of a proposed action. Next, it includes kind of a characterization of the affected areas, including physical and chemical conditions. And that's summarized by the depth, the wave regime, and the current velocities, including dispersal, horizontal transport, and vertical mixing. Includes a description of the seafloor topography, or the bathymetry, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term. It includes geological structures and hazards, or what's known about the place where the proposed activity is going to be. It includes the biological features that are there. So these are the critical marine habitats, important marine habitats, such as kelp beds or algae beds, seagrass beds, rocky reefs, marine mammals, seabird rookeries. So those are kind of the critical marine habitats. The fish and shellfish stocks, the recreational or commercially important species that are present, the planktonic and benthic flora and fauna that may be present in the specific area where the action is to be taking place, and other elements important to the primary productivity of the food chain. There may be also mineral deposits present in that particular area, and those must be described if known, and cultural, economic, and social uses present in the area, such as, but not to be limited to, commercial sport fishing, aquaculture, research, ports, navigation or dredge material disposal, recreation, tourism, mineral extraction, and or waste discharge. And then finally, on top of all those other things, is there significant historical or archaeological resources present within an area? So that is quite an inventory. And so we ask a lot of people proposing to do actions within the territorial seaplain. The effects evaluation is how we ask for that information to be provided and what we ask to be done with that information. So it says that a government agency shall use this or shall cause this list to be used by proponents in the determination of reasonably foreseeable adverse effects. And where relevant, that evaluation should include the potential short-term and long-term effects on the resources and uses of the continental shelf and other nearshore ocean areas, based upon the considerations as provided with the above inventory list. So you're talking about biological and ecological effects. You're talking about conformity and compatibility with existing and protected uses of ocean resources, such as fishing, recreational uses, ports, navigation, and waste discharge. Also, what are the reasonably foreseeable adverse effects on local and regional economies, archaeological or historical resources, transportation safety or accidents, geological hazards, and then also the cumulative effects of this project relative to other projects that have been put in place that are similar to it. The last piece of the reasonably foreseeable effects evaluation is that the determinations shall be based upon the best available scientific evidence and data provided, right? So it need not discuss quote unquote highly speculative consequences, right? So, but there is a requirement to talk about catastrophic environmental effects from events of a low probability. This might be best thought of as the Cascadia earthquake and subduction zone, and then tsunami that maybe follows as an example. And then it provides clarity on the use of the available information. So it basically says we shall use the best available information where possible. So including data from federal environmental impact statements or assessments, which also need to meet kind of these inventory criteria and standards. This section also provides what to do if there's insufficient or incomplete information as a part of a proposal. Steve, you have a comment?
Yeah, Andy, I would just jump in here and say that in using part two. Part two is for those uses that we don't have a specific path for. So if you were a cable, you'd use part four, and if you were a marine hydrokinetic project, you would use part five. So part two is to catch all the general for uses that there isn't a specific path.
Yes, thank you, Steve.
And the part four and part five are based on part two, and they're tailored for the specific uses that are in those two parts.
Correct. I remember going through the development of a new inventory list and effects evaluation for part five. So, continuing on with the concept of what to do if you have incomplete or insufficient information. The first is that you can, when the information is not sufficient to understanding the effects of a proposed action, is you can choose to terminate, suspend, or postpone a decision-making process until information is available. Or you can determine whether or not the information can be conducted with a limited environmental disturbance kind of criteria. So there's a pathway here to say, is this project so small that the potential effects are going to be limited in scope and scale that we can allow a project to move forward given those limited impacts. And then also there are provisions that apply to that little known policy area of the developmental fisheries. And there's kind of standards for what to do with incomplete or insufficient information in that regard. As mentioned, there is that limited environmental disturbance kind of clause and set of criteria. I'm not going to run through this in detail. I think it's we can talk about it later if need be, but it's a very, I guess, not very well used provision or part of the plan. And it basically describes a method for coming up with either how the additional information is to be developed or proposals for how it would be deemed insufficient or incomplete, and then therefore fall into the termination category from above. And again, I'm going to go through the developmental fisheries piece. I'll leave the text there for you to read if you are interested in that component. So the next section that I'm going to cover is basically the analysis of data and the inventory evaluation checklist. And this is just basically a recognition that proponents and opponents of any proposed development shall be held to the same standards when conducting this effects evaluation, and that as a guide, our Department of Land Conservation and Development is responsible for the development of a checklist for not only the relevant agencies, but also the proposers in understanding what information is to be required when a decision is being made. And there's a link, a hot link to the Territorial Sea Plan Part 2 checklist on the Department of State Lands page, which is the most commonly used checklist, given that that's the agency that most commonly will initiate a Part 2 review, given the lease authority of the Department of State Lands. The next and last I think item under the environmental or the inventory component is a description of the responsibility of the agencies to coordinate this process. So there's guidance for the fact that there are often multiple agencies that will be brought into a decision-making process, and that it is the Council's recommendation that there is a single point of contact and a process coordinator for the review, so that it's clear for applicants who they will be interacting with as a part of the process. It also provides guidance that individual agencies do have responsibilities to review specific components of the inventory and the effects analysis to ensure their consistency with OPAC's policies and with Goal 19. And then finally, there's another recognition of public participation and kind of best practice that agencies implementing this decision-making process will allow for opportunities for citizens to be involved in all phases of the planning. So that concludes kind of the inventory and the effects evaluation.
I know, before you leave the developmental fisheries part,
Sure.
I actually am curious, can you explain that? I mean, isn't there a program under ODFW that's currently not active, or, and is it, I guess I'm curious how it relates to that.
Yeah, so the developmental fisheries are a specific kind of state policy area where the Department of Fish and Wildlife can seek to develop a new fishery based upon scientific evidence of the availability of that resource. And the policies that are in the plan basically set the standards for how OPAC and the Department of Fish and Wildlife will interact in the development of the plan for that developmental fishery. Karin, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, so I haven't dug into this information in a while, and ODFW, the commission for ODFW disbanded the Development of Fisheries program. Legislative funding was taken away from that program early in my tenure in this position, and my recollection of it because of that is kind of foggy. But essentially, we had a whole section of our rules that was describing how these fisheries took place, and in terms of the connection between that rule-making process and OPAC, I'm not sure if there was any discussion or not, and if there was discussion, what the nature of that discussion was, but that was in rule, and has been taken out because of the inability to support that program. So in the absence of a program for developmental fisheries, we still continue to have fisheries that are happening, that are on species that are not recognized by the Pacific Fisheries Management Council and don't have a lot of structure around them that we manage and we monitor over time. There are multiple smaller fisheries that fall into that category, but we don't have a specific program that is trying to promote access to those species per se. So I don't know if that addresses your interest, Gina, or whether you would like to have more information on that at some point.
No, I it doesn't really answer my question what the intersection is between OPAC and those rules, but it tells me that it's not that important at this moment.
Yeah, I can look more closely into that piece and try and provide other comments and thoughts, but it seems to be a kind of vestigial portion of the plan as it exists today. So moving back to part 2, the resources use and effects analysis. OPAC created this section of the plan to cover how they envisioned basically project review to be conducted. And this is based upon an original recommendation from the Ocean Plan, where the creation of quote-unquote project review panels would be implemented to coordinate more complex decisions. So a lot of agencies that have to be at the table, as an example. And the 1991 legislature specifically responded to the ocean plan and authorized OPAC to create project review panels to address and to coordinate feedback on proposals in the interest of the state. They were also given authority to adopt administrative rules for the panels, or at least that's what's currently in this section of Part 2. And OPAC decided to change the name of these to Joint Review Panels, or JRPs, basically performing the same function. So what's covered in this section of the plan? It's the purpose, the functions and duties of a joint review panel, the membership, when one should be convened, how it will evaluate recommendations, or how it will move recommendations forward and how those will be considered. And then there's some guidance on public meetings laws, the authority to do so, and administrative rules. So moving into kind of the implementation of a joint review panel, again, they are stood up when appropriate to coordinate interagency involvement and decision making. And they must use the Ocean Plan and the Territorial Sea Plan and Goal 19 as their criteria review benchmarks. And their review of the recommendations shall focus on specific technical issues that may include but are not limited to applications for permits, leases, or other forms of kind of approval for an activity, development actions that are being proposed by an agency, such as facility construction or alteration of ocean habitats, or the development of resource management plans. Whether or not funding by an agency or another party is related to the actions, the proposed actions. And again, the review may include, but is not limited to, marine resource management plans that are being proposed by government agencies and or proposed state agency administrative rules. So these are kind of all of the areas that OPAC, the council, envisioned a joint review panel being established for. Now again, this is something that does not happen very often. So in my tenure as an OPAC staff person, there have been no joint review panels that have been established. The closest thing is the proposal by M3 for a research project in the Camp Riley Renewable Energy Facilities Suitability Study area convened a JART. There was one meeting, 2 meetings of the JART, I can't remember exactly. And that was the Part 5 version of a joint review panel. Right, so as Steve mentioned before, if it wasn't a marine renewable energy proposal, then it would be covered by a joint review panel. The duties and or functions of a joint review panel include advice on the preparation of a resource inventory and effects evaluation. So what we just talked about, a proposer completing, basically if there's guidance to them on work that needs to be included. Review and comment on the adequacy of environmental documents or assessments, like a NEPA environmental assessment, mitigation plan, and or monitoring programs. So those are activities that are appropriate for a joint review panel. Advice on the design of environmental disturbances or special permits or conditions for different activities, including lease stipulations or mitigation measures. So if an action is to move forward, there may be measures that will make it consistent with Goal 19 that the panel would recommend. And finally, review and comments on alternatives to the proposed action. So if the joint review panel does not kind of agree with the proposed action, they can comment on alternatives that may be considered. this membership of a joint review panel, and there's a one-word sentence up there at the beginning, which I thought was quite appropriate, and that is flexibility. So the council, in its wisdom, decided that membership shall be determined on a case-by-case basis, depending upon the actions and the interests that are being considered as a part of a proposed activity. And then it does include some limitations on membership, including that it does allow a non-state agency member of OPAC, but they have to have no conflict of interest related to the proposed action. There may be limited representatives of entities with regulatory, proprietary, or statutorily mandated consultative responsibilities. So if you have a responsibility to review something that's a part of your job duty for a state or federal agency, and then persons not representing the proposer or the OPAC listed above, but individuals who have relevant technical expertise and no conflict of interest may also be included. So that's a pretty broad definition of who may be on the joint review panel, because it basically says who may not, rather than giving a exhaustive list of who may be. The next section covers when a joint review panel should be convened or may be convened. These are pretty standard. It's when there's a need for coordination and review, when no better mechanism exists for interagency coordination and review of the proposed action, and when either the proposed action involves either a large complex project that requires multiple agencies, both from inside and outside of state government, or if there is a new or unique project which the understanding and coordination of which would be significantly improved by the contributions of members of the joint review panel. So pretty general, and it seems very flexible in when one of these should be established or stood up. Who convenes a joint review panel? Well, it may be OPAC. It may be upon the request of a state or a federal agency, a local government, or other interested party. Or if none of those has happened, then OPAC, on its own initiative, may convene a joint review panel. And then there are some other policies. Again, as I mentioned, the joint review panel will make a recommendation to the decision-making body, but that is provided as advice. And the advice is to include written findings and conclusions that explain how the agency's decision is consistent with the applicable statutes, rules, and policies. So again, tying everything back to the ocean management framework that we have built is one of the requirements of the recommendations that will come from a joint review panel. And then there's guidance on public meetings that shall be open. Authority for a joint review panel is only as granted to them by OPAC, so it's an advisory role, and they have no independent authority on their own. And then there's there's guidance that OPAC shall, by administrative rule, set procedural and substantive requirements and standards to carry out these policies for joint review panels. So OPAC has the ability to tailor and amend those things. The final section of Part 2 is a description of the process, the mandatory process for consultation with local coastal governments, including coastal tribes. And this part of the plan goes into basically what happens and how it's supposed to happen, where if there's a proposed impact to a local government from an action, how the joint review panels must interact with, and or the decision-making body must interact with local governments, right? So it describes a consultation process, which includes kind of three basic parts, one of which is that agencies inform local governments of the opportunity to comment on any proposed major ocean development. Agencies must respond in writing to local government comments, and they must offer assistance to local governments if appropriate. So I'm going to cover basically those three broad areas. The first of which is a definition of what a major ocean development activity is. So there's a number of criteria that must be, that are met for being deemed a major ocean development activities. And this is this part of the plan is really, I think, a best, and this is one of the mandatory policies of the plan, given that all of Part 2 is mandatory. And it really codifies kind of the interaction that must occur between the decision-making agency and a local government. It then describes who is eligible as a local government to be consulted with. And there's a number of criteria, or there's two criteria really that guide that. One of which is either compatible or incompatible activities with specific provisions in a local comprehensive plan. And that is, again, is related to land use decision within the local government's land use planning jurisdiction, and or if the proposed activity is contrary to the beneficial interest of the community, and whether or not there are secondary or indirect adverse or beneficial effects not covered by the local comprehensive plan. So that guidance really sets basically who will be interacted with if this process is to occur. The plan then sets up the responsibility of agencies in their interactions with local governments. It references state agency coordination rules. So we have, our department and DSL have state agency coordination rules that guide the implementation of our policies. There's a description of agencies that must respond to a proposed activity with a local government, and there's criteria for understanding that. And then there's a reference to the duties to inform local governments of these proposed activities when they occur, and some criteria listed that describes that process. Again, to continue on with this line of thought for a duty of a decision-making body to inform local governments, they need to be provided an adequate opportunity to comment on the proposed major ocean development. And then the activities that agencies must do need to be sufficient enough to inform the local governments of the nature of the major ocean development. And we need to inform them that a mandatory local government process can take place or is occurring. And then the opportunities that the local governments have to submit comments. And then there is a section there that guides then what needs to be in the agency's response to a local government after receiving comment. And those are closely related to how the proposed activity impacts a local government related to their local plan and the compatibilities of the local plan with the proposed action. There may be proposed responses to the actions, including revising the proposed development, allowing the local government's time to amend the comprehensive plan to accommodate for onshore effects of the development, and/or for agencies to work with local officials to conduct educational and informational workshops that addressed the expressed community concerns. So, continuing along with the consultation kind of policies and the response, it describes, there's a couple bullets here that describes the response related to specific kind of focuses of interest, local community interest, tribal government, other groups. And then there's a no new inventory requirement, which is somewhat confusing. But it basically says that the consultation process does not create a new requirement for the proponents to generate information on local community effects. And finally, a little bit of guidance on local plan compatibility and the communications that occur as a result. So this part of the plan really just covers the fact that there may be technical assistance that an agency will provide to a local government to help explain or educate the public about the proposed action. They may provide technical assistance in the form of model plan amendments that can be made by local government if they want to implement something ahead of a proposed activity. And/or they may provide specific plan amendments and/or mitigation based upon compatibility of the action with the proposed local government plan. Whew. Okay. That completes our tour through part 2 of the Territorial Sea Plan.
So Andy, just to kick off the Q&A, I have received 2 questions that I just want to ask. So one of them is that it seems like in part 2 there's been a lot of dormant portions, like the joint review panels, for example. Are those just kind of an insurance policy if some new thing falls out of the sky we don't foresee? That's one question. And the other is, why does OPAC set up work groups versus setting up using this joint review panel process?
So the first one, I think, is we want to have something in place that will allow us to review proposals that we have not previously thought about or foreseen. And a joint review panel and the inventory and effects requirements allow us to get the information we need about the proposed activity so that agencies and local communities can review their plans and their policies to see whether or not the proposed activity has reasonably foreseeable adverse effects of that action. So while a joint review panel has not been established recently in my memory, who's to say that we don't have a proposal that comes in the next month for some activity we never would have considered. Maybe there's a competition for underwater ballerinas in the Territorial Sea. I don't know. Basically, there's an opportunity for us to, stand up a group of people who have technical expertise and relevancy related to the plans and the policies that will review that activity and consider whether or not its impacts are acceptable based upon our laws, policies, and rules. So while it has not been used, it can be used at any time for a proposed action that comes to the state in the Territorial Sea. Patty?
I was just gonna say, for example, we've been hearing more folks interested in aquaculture. We don't have a section that specifically addresses aquaculture. So if somebody did come in with a proposal to do that in the Territorial Sea, we have part 2 to cover it and the process set up for that. So we think it's important to have it in case because we haven't anticipated every single use that might be proposed in the Territorial Sea.
Great, and before we move on to other questions, I just want to finish the second one, is why do we groups as OPAC versus using this process?
Yeah, so this process is specifically for the evaluation of a proposed activity relative to the state's policies and plans. Work groups of OPAC have been established to amend the plan based upon advice from local governments or the issued survey. And so work groups are targeted more towards administration of our own plan rather than the review of a proposed activity.
So next was Charlie, then Richard, then
I think this kind of goes back to Patty's point and maybe a question that I have. Part 2 was intended for activities that we at one time anticipated and now don't anticipate maybe. But we've developed part 5 and also even part 3 for other types of, whether they be activities or designations in the territorial sea plan. So my question is, do we potentially see this group adding more parts to the territorial sea plan like we did for part 5 to address new or existing uses? Or is it better for us to try and continue to modify part 2 to reflect these new uses that come in? Aquaculture, for example, I mean, this is a big kind of broader OPAC question, but like, we would jump at, if we got a bunch of aquaculture proposals tomorrow, would we be responding by creating a new part to the territorial sea plan, or would we be using guidance from section part 2?
Yeah, that is a decision that the council, I think, would be responsible for making. And part of that's going to be a consideration of the time and energy and resources put into either the development of another specific section of the plan, or whether or not we feel like a proposed activity could be reviewed by a smaller subset of OPAC or community members as a part of a joint review panel, and can be handled individually if there's not a driving force behind other similar applications of the same kind. Steve?
I would say that when we had the circumstance of OPT applying for a marine hydrokinetic project in Reedsport, when that first came to us, we had to process that through part 2. And in having gone through that experience, we decided we needed a part 5. So it may be that you get an aquaculture, we don't get to say, stop, we're not gonna process that, we're gonna develop a plan. We're gonna have to take it up under part 2. We may learn in doing so that we want to need part 6, if you will, to address that. But part 2's there for that thing that comes in the door that we're not otherwise ready for with a specific policy.
Richard?
How about existing activities, not proposed activities, but existing activities that have huge impact on territorial stations? That should be considered here.
So the question, to repeat it, because I think it was pretty quiet, is what about existing activities and how are they evaluated relative to the plan and policies?
Specifically to this section, and I guess all with some trepidation, we annually deploy thousands of uncharted navigational hazards in the territorial sea that impact several other parts of the fishing industry. And I'm talking about Dungeness crab pots that are deployed without, from my knowledge, without regard to where other fisheries occur, where marine mammals migration paths go, or navigation channels. And I've asked this question to the Coast Guard, and they punt to the state, and then I've asked the state, and they punt back to the Coast Guard. So I'm just curious if that's something that would be contemplated in part 2.
So I think that the answer to this question is that the crab fishery is technically a protected use under Goal 19, and it's recognized as a beneficial use because it's the kind of renewable heart harvest of a resource within the territorial sea that Goal 19 says that we value from both an economic and a social perspective. And as such, the conduct of the fishery is part of that protected use. So when Goal 19 was established and developed and amended, it was very clear that we not only recognize the fisheries that exist, but that we protect them. So I think that the activity that's associated with that use is recognized as being protected under Goal 19.
But I think one question is, I mean, it may be protected, but what I hear Richard saying is that should you not plan for potential conflicts? I mean, no one's saying stop.
Yeah, and I don't know that Goal 19 is specific enough to weight a single fishery over other fisheries that are in existence. It's an interesting question. Richard, you can follow up?
Well, it has implications beyond fisheries. It has public safety implications particularly. And believe me, I'm not down on London crab fishing. The issue of crab pot is a big issue for people who navigate the ocean, whether they're recreational fishermen or sound trollers, or in some cases people who trawl. Because they're out there randomly placed. And I can tell you from the perspective of recreational fishing boat, if you get a crab line in your wheel, you have big trouble. And so I'm asked all the time, what can we do about these crab pots? And I mean, that's a tough question because it's a multi-million-dollar industry that Oregon takes the benefit of. It's great for the coastal communities, but there are some issues. So that's just why I brought it up.
So,
Yeah, and I don't know the answer to that question. I think that's a broader policy discussion has to occur.
and Karin, you were to speak next, so you might want to address my previous things, or maybe you have a question.
Yeah, thank you. My previous comment has been answered, but just relative to the fisheries issues. I mean, Richard and I work together through different roles that he plays in fisheries and the agency. So this is an ongoing discussion. But I think that the bulk of the issues related to the Dungeness crab fishery are fishery specific, and so they're probably best addressed through the commission and multi-fisheries interactions kinds of processes rather than through OPAC. OPAC, in my view, has typically pulled together folks that are not necessarily related as closely as the constituents or the user groups that you've just talked about, and the renewable energy plan, part 5, is a good example of that, where folks that you wouldn't expect to find in the same room all came together to talk about the use of that resource and space utilization and so on. So those are my thoughts about that, and it is an issue. We deploy something like 150,000 pots every year in a commercial fishery. It's a big enterprise, and it is a huge economic driver, and it's relatively sustainable, and it causes user conflicts, and so that's, I'm not gonna say that it's not a problem.
And Karin, just for clarification, you said commission, but I think you meant Pacific Fisheries Management Council?
No, they didn't.
No?
The commission.
You
It's a
meant your
managed
state
commission.
wildlife commission, okay,
Yeah, it is not under the jurisdiction of the Pacific Fisheries.
okay. Thank you for that clarification.
All right, just a quick check. Can folks in the audience hear? Are we doing better at projecting? I'm hearing, I see thumbs up, kind of. Okay. Bob, you're next.
I just got to wondering, being fairly new to this group. Back on page 15, you're talking about the inventory content. I was wondering about seafloor coring, if that was addressed. In other words, the stability of the sediment layers. If you're gonna put a several hundred ton block of concrete for a wind tower out there, or you're gonna have the wind tower out there at 45 degrees in a couple of years.
I believe that would be covered under geological structure and hazards. I think there's maybe a bullet or two I did not include there that talk about subsea structure or subsurface structure. And for proposed activities where there will be seafloor disturbance, I don't think a company would invest without doing the surveys of that hazard in a particular location.
You never know, one
Ye-
disappears.
That's true, but I think that would be covered under the geological structure and hazards item